Out here in the perimeter, there are no stars. Out here, we is stoned, immaculate.
Hello and welcome. This is the C86 show. I'm David Eastaugh. As you know, we love a special guest. This week it's going to be the turn of the writer James Brown, who's just brought a book out titled Animal House, which talks about his life, childhood, school, plus life as a fanzine writer, which is fantastic, the NME years, and then Loaded, as well as various other bits and pieces. This is the book's available from all good bookshops, and also if you go to his social media sites, Instagram being a good one, you will find how you can get a signed copy. I will just tell you one thing that slightly happened in this interview was my vocal seems very quiet, which is a bit of a shame, but thankfully hopefully that won't spoil it too much, but I am very quiet, so I apologise. But anyway, after several minutes of casual chat, we got down to that exciting subject that was the early formative years. James, it's over to you.
Well, just as I say in the book, when I was really young, I just got these memories of lying on the carpet in my living room with my mum and dad's long record player with all this big box of singles. And the ones that I really loved were HQ Park and Lazy Sunday Afternoon by the Small Faces, Lady Madonna by the Beatles. I Got Stung by Elvis, Judy in Disguise by John Fred and the Playboy Band. They were the tracks that I listened to over and over again. And that's when I was really, really young. And Satisfaction as well by the Stones on a big compilation they had. So it sounds like I've manicured that, I've kind of like edited it back for, a sense of cool, but I haven't. They're the songs I listen to over and over again. And in addition to that, Little White Bull by Tommy Steele. And on the B side of that, there was Mud, Mud, Glorious Mud. And then also the Trumpton album. But this is like at the end of the 60s, when I was 4, 5, 6 years old. And, and it was just, so I had that experience of listening to great music when I was very young. And then when I was about 8, 7, 8, 9, on Top of the Pops, every Thursday, just all those amazing solarized acts, the way that they were covered in glitter, sunglasses, draped coats, tinfoil covered guitars. I mean, the whole glam era was very exciting for young kids, basically the bands looked like sweets. They looked like Christmas all the time. And they were all really easy to sing along to and clap along to. And so Suzi Quatro, The Sweet, Mud. My favorite band at that time was Slade. I used to absolutely love Slade. And Mark Bolan, of course. I had an older mate I played football with, Pete Masters, who had Bolan albums that he used to play me. So that was it, really. It wasn't, I've heard people say they had, moments of epiphany seeing David Bowie or something, but it wasn't like that. It was just soaking it all up. My mum and dad listened to a lot of music in the house. My dad in the 70s was always playing Bob Dylan, and my mum liked Neil Diamond and Hot Chocolate. And so I guess in that respect, I was lucky, there was just good music in the house.
Yes, amazing. Did you, during, with the book, it is kind of quite amazing in a lot of ways, but obviously your family life, there's an amazingly sad bit in the book at the beginning where you're talking about being in the playground, playing with the tennis ball with all your mates and stuff. And then, your mum would come and see you, and look at you from the road. When you were writing this, were these kind of quite a lot of memories that had slightly been buried that you were starting to have to process again? Because it was kind of quite heartbreaking.
I'm definitely somewhere on the beginning of the spectrum, and I've got a really detailed memory for a lot of things. So strangely, those memories weren't buried. They were in my mind, but they were like one of millions of things that were in my head, and that was difficult trying to sieve through everything that was in there.
Yeah.
And obviously, there's certain things that I don't remember, but the things I do remember, I remember being cleared, really clear. Sometimes I can close my eyes and go on journeys through houses that I've lived in and re-see everything. I've never told anyone this, but it's quite strange being able to do that. And so yeah, they were all kind of there. It was just a matter of picking the right ones. But that kind of just, I suppose, I mean, when I was writing the book, I kept thinking, I'm not sure this is the right balance to be writing the really personal stuff that influenced me, and then the public facing stuff that they already covered, like, the years unloaded and years writing about bands on Sounds and NME. But I was having to think about how the two were connected. And I felt like I need to explain my behavior a bit in my early 20s, because I was very wound up and aggressive. And I don't think my colleagues at NME ever realized what was going on, when I wasn't in the office, or when I was getting phone calls and my mum was in hospital again. So that's why I revisited those things, to explain the influence on me.
Yes. Well, I often, and it doesn't happen quite so much, but in my, younger days, being a bit judgmental at someone's behavior, and then occasionally someone would say, well, you've got to remember, there's probably a lot of pain that they're going through. So that behavior, okay, you can't excuse it, but there is a reason for it, why they're acting like it. And I guess when you wrote this book and explained your childhood, it kind of then makes a lot, the pieces kind of fall into place, don't they? Because it's kind of interesting, the book, because when I've read it, and the first bit and the 80s, there's this kind of real sense of almost joy. And then when I was reading the from the 90s, I don't know what you were feeling when you were writing that bit, but there was almost a sense of melancholia that started to come into the. I don't know if you were feeling much more reflective thinking back at the 90s.
About what? Which bit about my mum?
No, not about your mum. Your childhood and the 80s period had a kind of had a real sort of not happiness, but there was a sense of kind of excitement.
Well, no, I was really happy. I was really, as a kid, I was, apart from having what they now describe as an eating disorder, apart from having that, and my parents not getting on sometimes, and my mum being ill. As a kid at school or in the street or playing football or whatever, I was really happy. And I like writing about those things. I wrote a lot about it in my book. I wrote about playing football above head height. And what I think what you were asking me about, the previous question about reflecting on and thinking about things, what became apparent was, as a typical young kid, my kind of social life and my school life and playing out was all great. And then when I was about 14 or 15, there was the rise of CND and the fear that we were going to get blown up.
Yes.
The Yorkshire Ripper was killing people in the area that I lived.
Was the Black Panther in your area before then?
Yes, but he only killed one person, I think, Leslie Whittle.
Right.
Possibly, I don't know. But so there was sort of had this, suddenly in the mid-teens, my parents split up. My mum was ill. There was impending and ever-increasing mass unemployment. There was the miners' strike a bit later. And it just all went a bit dark, It was, and then I think in many ways, the fun that I had at Loaded, and I wasn't melancholy in my 20s at all. The fun that I had at Loaded was kind of reclaiming that sense of fun I had as a child that had got cut off.
Yeah.
Had been sort of stopped early, and I was very I could have written a lot more about the stuff I did, the political activity. I was a really political kind of 14, 15, 16-year-old, going on all sorts of different marches, being face to face with the National Front at Ellen Road when they were handing out their stickers and selling Bulldog. Just being involved a little bit in that the Great Rock Against Racism gig in Leeds with the Specials and the Au Pairs and Misty and Roots.
Mm.
They were just, that was a really big part of my life, and
Yeah, because in the book you capture that kind of period really stunningly well, because that's, I suppose, what sort of slightly made me keep pausing and reflecting, because 79, Thatcher gets in. You mentioned there was also the Falkland, the miners' strike, Greenham Common, as you mentioned, with CND, and the idea that we were all going to, when Ronald Reagan got in, we thought that was all over, and then was Thatcher as well. So there was that, yeah. And it was kind of interesting because you don't mention Red Wedge or the Anti-Poll Tax League within this, and then, but you say, so I didn't know if you'd been that involved in those things, but as you just mentioned,
I wasn't sure about Red Wedge. I kind of, I was quite left wing by then. That seemed quite mainstream.
But you mentioned the Redskins and Chris.
But the difference was that Red Wedge was essentially trying to get people to vote Labour. But if you were screaming, anarcho-socialist teenager, Labour didn't seem that exciting. Whereas, when I was writing about the Redskins and the Three Johns and people like the Newtown Neurotics, and I know Billy Bragg was with Red Wedge, but also these guys were doing tremendous amounts of benefits to raise money in Yorkshire for the striking miners. So it was a much more direct and immediate and necessary form of musical and political action, because you would just, there'd be people with buckets looking for change. There'd be the money raised from the tickets for the gigs. And it was, as a sort of 18-year-old, being involved in that sort of thing and going to the picket lines with my dad. It was a really, it was at the sharp end. I've just been watching that drama series, Sherwood, with David Morrissey, and it takes me back to that sort of, I was explaining to my person I was watching it with that it just felt like Britain was at war with itself. Every night you turn the television on and some other young man had been shot in Northern Ireland. It was usually young men that were dying, probably a little bit my age or a little bit older, either soldiers or civilians. And it was a really conflicted time. And it was my memory of looking back on that, which I do go into in the book, is the big AIDS posters. That was there was no real sense of, I think now, sorry, if you think about the way information about diseases and to try and explain things that are going on, but with the AIDS posters, they were trying to terrify people, and then that's what stigmatized the kind of the gay community even more, because it primarily was being transmitted, through kind of like in that community and initially. And so I think those, the anti-AIDS and the anti-drugs posters were just terrifying, And also I remember being in Dublin when I was about 18, or anywhere, going to Liverpool or Sheffield or different cities. There were just people lying around on the streets, absolutely fucked, not homeless people, like, smack addicts. And so when you're kind of 15, 16, 17, and you're seeing this kind of economic disparity going on, I think, that was really what was kind of feeding me, and also not feeding me, but, affecting me.
Yes.
And, the way to deal with that at the time, I felt like just go on demonstrations, raise money, go to benefit gigs, and so on. That sort of thing was my life.
Yes. Do you, I mean, on that point, because something that I've slightly, I try not to get wound up, I do occasionally. But I know when Dylan Jones does his 80s and he goes about the 80s and it's the Face and the Blitz Kids and Spandau Ballet and Live Aid, does that ever make you feel a little bit irritated thinking, yeah, that wasn't my 80s?
What, that it was all Spandau Ballet?
And the Face and the Blitz and everyone was dressed
It's a
up.
different world. I mean, it doesn't irritate me because,
oh, that's good.
When I moved to Manchester from Leeds when I was about 20, the boys that I lived with were about 3 years older than me. And I used to see them on Saturday night. My attire at the time would be a pair of combat trousers and a T-shirt with a Dead Kennedys or something on the front of it. And they'd be ironing their trousers and their shirts, reading the Face. And it was just a different, even though they were from the same sort of backgrounds as me, they were a little bit older. And I remember when the Face came out, it was a music magazine. And, it was an out and out, it was just another one of Nick Logan's. He'd rebuilt The Enemy, or he'd changed The Enemy, he'd launched Smash Hits, and then he launched another one, and so I think I was surprised when Spandau Ballet made that film, and I haven't, to be honest, I haven't seen it, but when they were talking in interviews about seeing themselves as sort of socialist soul boys, because that didn't come across from the people who liked gold, and invariably, if in the years since, whenever they show the 80s, they show, to typify what was going on in Britain, they show a mounted policeman smacking a striking miner over the head with a baton, and they show yuppies pouring champagne into chandeliers of wine glasses and champagne flutes, playing gold. I think they were different things. They were kind of, it was escapist mainstream music, and that was a world away from the underground scene of fanzines and,
yes,
kind of small independent clubs that I was going to in Manchester and Bradford and Hull and so on.
Yes, because a few years ago, did you get this particular publication, Ripped, Torn and Cut, fanzines? It was on
No.
Manchester. Well, it was interesting because Claire, who then became part of Sarah Records, or started Sarah Records, this is when I sort of kind of not first came across you, but then she mentions you in here, saying that you kindly met up in Leeds and spent an afternoon showing me how to make paste ups, explaining what would and wouldn't copy or print well. So yes, so you're the 80s. The fanzine.
Did she have a fanzine called Kavach?
Yes.
See, that's my memory there.
That's very good.
I think she was from Harrogate or somewhere.
Yeah, well,
I've never seen that, Yeah, so it was sadly we seem to be heading back to those. Well, we're already knee deep in those sort of times again, in sort of extreme economic disparity between the haves and have-nots.
Yes, but fanzines. Your
yes.
Fanzine, was this because there was the enterprise, the enterprise allowance scheme, wasn't there? And those various things that the government had sort of brought together. So did you go on one of those enterprise allowance kind of things, or?
Yeah, they were. I left school. I started my fanzine in the first year of the sixth form with 3 mates. I left school, and then one of my mates went on a youth training scheme, and he said, "Let's print the fanzines there," and that was good. That meant we got really good quality printing, and Andy got something interesting to print rather than local government and local council leaflets. And the enterprise allowance scheme is actually quite a good idea, really, if you were already making money.
Yes.
Because it basically
it
stopped. I mean, they should do it again now. Now, if you're on the equivalent of the old enterprise allowance scheme, you call a benefit sheet.
Yes.
What it was you get your £14 a week, which sounds nuts now. You get 28 quid a fortnight when you're on the dole. But what they did was, I think they put it, or maybe it was 24 quid, and they put it up to 28 if you went on the enterprise allowance scheme. And what it did was it allowed enterprise. So if you were in a band or you had a market stall or you were selling fanzines or putting gigs on or whatever your kind of little side, your attempts to make a living were suddenly you can do it without this fear of, not a fear, but suddenly you were allowed to do it. Before then, you weren't allowed to make any money if you're on the dole. So a lot of people that I knew were on that because it just legitimized all the things we were doing. But even as I said in the book, Bobby Gillespie and Andrew Innes told me when I wrote some sleeve notes for a box set of Screamadelica, they were still on the enterprise allowance, quite far into Primal Scream's existence. And so I did write a bit more than that in the book, but that's one of the little bits I took out. And how, we all went on the enterprise allowance scheme. And
I think that's why there's so many bands in the 80s, because you had that period where you were leaving school and there was no opportunity. Well, it didn't feel like there was any opportunity. So
there weren't any opportunities.
So there was like, go on the dole. There was no stigma. It was almost like a rite of passage. And then if you had that £1,000 in your bank account, you could do this enterprise allowance scheme, which was...
Is that what you needed to have?
£1,000, something bizarre like that. So people would pass this £1,000 to show they had some money, which seemed a bit odd. And then...
well, the thing is, I don't remember that because I definitely didn't have £1,000.
Enterprise allowance, and there was another one. I don't know.
I mean, it sounds like the sort of thing they would have said, but I didn't have £1,000 then at all.
but that creative time was quite interesting because a lot of people were then, able just to focus on being in a band, making music, and then they'd have that 1 year sort of rehearse, get a single. John Peel played it, got the John Peel session. Suddenly that first album, get the transit band, go around the entire country with all the small little gigs and venues that normally had an indie night on a Monday, Tuesday or Wednesday. And then they just had that momentum to almost make the second album and then possibly, disintegrate by the third.
I think, when I see people, no disrespect to the name of your podcast, but when I see people getting excited about C86, I find it weird because I don't find it weird for them, but for me, because my mates and I who were doing fanzines, we knew all about those bands 18 months before the NME put them on that tape.
Yes.
And it was only 6 months since Neil Taylor started championing them. But, for a year before that, the likes of Age of Chance and Big Flame and the June Brides and so on, they'd all had singles out. They'd all been like playing these tiny little clubs like, the Unity Club in Hull or the Wild Club in Manchester or Jeff Barrett's Ziggy's Club down in Plymouth. So or Bobby Gillespie's Splash One in Glasgow.
Well, there was Alan McGee's The Living Room as well, wasn't
there? Yeah, that was the one that would be putting them on in the London. There was kind of the influences of that era of bands were like The Fall and Captain Beefheart, and I guess some of the postcard bands. And with Age of Chance, they were also, they were into soul and Test Department and things like that as well. So it was just. I think it was those influences that just gave that new era energy, because around and before then there was still the more obvious kind of punk influences at play, or what became goth, and so the kind of like the mix of music that you would hear at the Phono in Leeds, where a lot of the goth bands or the punk influenced bands would hang out, would be Iggy or Killing Joke or Generation X or the Velvet Underground and stuff. And then it sort of just opened up and got lighter, with people like Big Flame talking about a Gang of Four and the Fire Engines and Airto Marewa and just different types of music. More, I would see it as the C86 as more light getting into the room. Yes. Maybe bands stopped rehearsing in cellars.
Well, I think there was there was a chapter in the 80s, and it was from 83 to 87, which was the years of the Smiths, wasn't it? That was a kind of moment where indie pop in that way really was something. When they split up, I mean, I know it's a bit simplistic, but then Ecstasy comes along, and there's the next wave of bands that start to move in, and that's where you get a certain, you get the dance scene. and people like the Happy
Yeah,
Mondays and
that's a
Leeds.
very good analysis of the shifts. Yeah.
And then you also got Seattle coming in sort of 1989, 1990 with, and
Yeah.
then there was 4 AD with the Throw Mooses and Pixies. And by then, no one really wanted the next Darling Buds or the Primitives or the Mighty Lemon Drops next album. It was like, well, we had that 5 years ago, and they're not going to sound that interesting. And there's also that next wave of 16-year-olds that come along who are just going, yeah, forget it, Grandad. We don't want to know about the Smiths
There was
anymore.
certainly a huge amount of new bands emerging by the end of the 80s, and the bands that I was talking about there, the C86, some of the C86 era bands, or the my fanzine era, that they weren't called indie. It was like the charts were the alternative charts.
Yes.
People weren't calling them indie bands then, I don't think. I imagine if I got a copy of my fanzine now, I don't think that word would be in it. I think there was just a sense that there really was an underground, and there was a print underground. When I look back, I've got a folder with about like 40 or 50 fanzines in, and they were really diverse. Liverpool had the end, which my memory was at the end was about football as well as music. When I helped Peter republish it, I republished a compilation of the end. There's no football in it at all. The only references to football are people wearing bobble hats going to the match.
Right.
There's the experience of watching it, but there's no football writing in it. There's more poetry than football.
Yeah.
And then you went to Newcastle, where Viz was an independently produced magazine. And that basically started out as just as a fanzine, became this huge comic, ended up selling 1 million copies. And then there'll be, most of the fanzines were quite flimsy. And then there'd be some really big, thick ones like Vague, which was full of psychogeography and Manson and the Angry Brigade, as well as things like, Adam and the Ants and the Southern Death Cult. I used to love Vague. I thought it just looked absolutely fantastic. For me, that was the fact that was just like the best fanzine around, Vague. And then, of course, there were just hundreds of other little magazines, from, as I said in the book, I kind of knew all of these places with never having been there, Paisley, Greenock, Spalding Links. I can just Malvern Wells. I can remember all these seeing the titles and the addresses again and again and again, and posting fanzines out to places and getting them sent back. And wherever I went in the country, I would, whether it was to follow the Free Johns around or Big Flame or Serious Drinking or the Redskins and Newtown Erotics, you'd always meet another kid with a fanzine.
Right.
Always.
Yes.
Every gig. There were people. I mean, there was a big fanzine scene in Leeds. There was Tongue in Cheek, Whippings and Apologies, Nag, 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 Molotov Comics, which had been an influence on me, Raising Hell, which the guy that I started Attack on Bzaag with, Ben, he produced. There were absolutely loads of these. Manchester had Debris. There was one from Preston called Noise and Noise. There were Furious Apache in Scotland, Slow Dazzle. I mean, I could just go on and on, Beaten to the Bunch in York. I mean, it's all kind of coming back out now. I didn't get them out and looked at them when I wrote the book. But these were like I wasn't close to most of these people, but they were like the mates I wanted to have at school.
Yes.
But my mates at school were like kids that I played football with or just I was in class with. They didn't share that interest in that world of underground bands. A lot of my mates were into like heavy rock and Black Sabbath and AC/DC and old bands like Led Zeppelin and Hawkwind and Steppenwolf and stuff like that. Or, as modern as they would get would be the Stranglers. So I only had a couple of mates who I'd go to gigs with, whereas out there, especially when I left school, the rest of the country, through John Peel, through the Enemy letters pages, and mainly through this underground network of fanzine writers and readers, there was just this web all over the country. And it was, so I think we all kind of knew about, and the readers of those magazines, of those fanzines, knew about the C86 bands way before kind of Neil Taylor started writing them about them, and maybe Kath Carroll and Deli for Deli in the NME.
Yes. Yes, well, absolutely. So you're, my God, there's a lot there, because you go to Berlin, don't you, with Serious Drinking, and there you meet My Bloody Valentine, who are sort of recording at that stage, aren't they? In the sort of, this is the.
Oh, they weren't recording; they were just staying there. I got to know Serious Drinking, and they asked me if I wanted to go to Berlin with them, which I did, and I had a job then. I had a job in the HMV shop, and it was quite a lot of money compared to what I was getting on my paper round. So I got the money together and flew to Berlin, went to this venue where they were supposed to be on it. And I got there like 9:00, and the club opened at like 11 or something. And there was just this band on stage practicing or sound checking. And it was Kevin Shields and his friends from My Bloody Valentine. And this, again, was a few years before they started making records. And I don't know if you remember, but when they first made singles, they were I think they were on the same level as the Primitives. And it was quite kind of post-primal 60s, kind of Pebbles, poppy, punky sort of sound.
Yeah, because I did an interview with David, who was the original vocalist for the band, and he mentions going to Berlin because I think someone just offered them a place. So they were and I listened to those early records, and they were nothing like they became.
Yeah, I mean, I like those early records, and they. My two memories was, I didn't put this in the book, was they didn't smell too good. They hadn't had a bath for a long time, which I think they admitted themselves. And they also said, "You're moving." I said, "Oh, where do you guys?" Because obviously no one at all at that point, or indeed for another 18 months, have ever heard of My Bloody Valentine, apart from probably a few friends back in Ireland. And they said, "Oh, we're moving out of the room in the KOB, the Cobb squat that you're moving into." So they were kind of just squatting, and it's interesting how many people I met when they were young. It's kind of like I met Gillespie and the Mary Chain on a march. There was a march. It was the week, I think, of the Heysel disaster, and there was a C&D march that culminated in a concert at the Kelvin Hall in Glasgow, and the Pastels were playing, and a band called Wet 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 were playing. They were like a soul band. They hadn't become the big pop stars yet. They were just starting out. And I can remember being in Kelvin Gardens in front of the university, I think it was, and just seeing Douglas and Jim and William walking through with their thick kind of loaves of curly hair sitting on top of their head, all wearing black. And then Bobby and Chris from Slow Dazzle introduced me. And at that point, the Mary Chain were the only kind of only band in that sort of alternative scene that felt like they were going to really, maybe they were going to change something. Maybe it was going to be like an earthquake, and it would. That's what it felt like.
Because interestingly, another one of those moments, that 87 was the first Glastonbury I went to, and that was your first Glastonbury. I just thought of that because you talked about not smelling very good, because no one ever wet washed at festivals in those days.
Yeah.
So when you went to your first Glastonbury, did you get quite enamored by the experience and think this is going to be?
I actually think I might have got that wrong in the book. I think I might have gone in 88. What I do know is that I've got no memory of the music of when I first went to Glastonbury, because I just thought it was a hippie festival, was not something that I would naturally have been drawn towards. And I think I must have gone the first year the NME sponsored it. And but I liked it. I liked seeing all these fucking mad people. And it really was very different to festivals now. It was probably closer to what it had been in the early 70s when it started. And there was a lot of the people that were kind of dropped out of mainstream life who were living in, they became known as the convoy. But that sort of alternate lifestyle of festivals and living in big old army trucks and having an independent culture. There was a big sense of that kind of community at Glastonbury at the time. And I liked it. I liked wandering around the fields and seeing people absolutely off their faces, and just the way it was just very different. I like the freedom of it. And it was just different to anything I'd been. I never went to a music festival when I was before I became a music writer. They just didn't really appeal to me, and also they were expensive, they were kind of, when an album was costing like £3.90 or something, going to a festival might have been a fiver for 2 days or something. And, so,
outrageous.
Yeah, it sounds bonkers, doesn't it?
But then your transition, because not only were you into sort of, I don't know, Big Flame, Stump and Bogshed, but you also got...
I wasn't a massive Stump fan. I liked the band that predated them, the Five Go Down to the Sea.
Oh, yes.
And I wasn't a massive Bogshed fan either. These were just bands like Bogshed, Yeah, No. They were bands you'd write about because they were there, and they were coming through, and they were all very influenced by The Fall and the Nightingales and Beefheart. And they were nice guys, they were kind of, whether they were men or women, and they were kind of, that was the scene, that you would report on.
Yes.
But I don't listen to their records now.
But you also embrace dance music. Can you remember with the NME, you had these two, didn't you?
Yeah.
So you got...
Well, the reason how I got into... Well, I mean, I kind of like... I was always... Although I kind of like, would write about a particular type of music, as I've just said, it's essentially because it was there, and I think if you stood in the 1 in 12 club in Bradford or Brannigan's and Leeds and the bands on are the Nightingales and Bogshed, that's who you write about, that's, if you're listening to John Peel and then you see there's bands coming from John Peel show to you, that's who I would go and see. But I kind of like quite varied music. And when I went to Manchester to live, I had a girlfriend in Manchester, so I went over there and I lived with Big Flame, of Alan from Big Flame, and Greg and Alan and Dill had this absolutely brilliant club called the Wild Club. And the DJs were Greg and Dill from the band and Dave Haslam, who had a fanzine called Debris. Dave's obviously a respected music writer now and a DJ. And he was DJing then, and they were just playing stuff that I hadn't heard before. They were playing things like Trouble Funk and Mantronics. And, if I went back to Leeds, that was on a Thursday night. If I went back the next night, I went to the phono, it would still be exactly the same songs, which were great songs, whether it was, Dancing with Myself or, War Dance by Killing Joke or, whoever it was, Iggy, it was dark. And then, but at the Wild Club, they were kind of mixing up hip hop and kind of, you wouldn't be unusual to hear Trouble Funk going into the Fire Engines or something like that at their little club at the Man Alive in Manchester. So that's really where, and Greg Keefe was really, he was the guitarist in Big Flame, and he was really into jazz as well, and kind of like, he just had a lot of very different records, and so I spent quite a lot of time listening to Greg's record collection and then hearing Dave and Dill and Greg playing, and that was really where, it was good for me to hear that stuff, because then music started to change. The Beastie Boys were the most obvious, and Run DMC were the most obvious exponents of kind of where rap was kind of getting rock to back it up. But then moving to London to write for Sound, suddenly being able to just go to the Town and Country Club and see Curtis Mantronic or go to the same venue and actually see Trouble Funk play. But I mean, in Leeds, I'd seen Chuck Brown and the Soul Searchers at the uni, who were absolutely amazing. But when I was on Sounds, I was deliberately writing about a lot of different music because I wanted the enemy to notice me. And also I was trying to make a living, obviously I was wanting to write about things, but I was wanting to eat as well. So that's the period when my musical taste really broadened.
Yes. Did you have, a lot of people often mention their moment where they first took ecstasy? Did you Do you have can you remember that moment if you ever took ecstasy?
No, I can't. I can't remember the last time I took it either.
Oh, well, that's
I
good.
can't remember. I can't. That's a good question. Do you know what? It's been quite good doing these interviews. It's some kid, young guy that bought my magazine this week. Sorry, some guy that's bought my book, not a magazine. He asked me if I had ever met Kurt Cobain this week, and I had to think about it. And I remember meeting Kurt, and this is the same sort of question. I can't remember the first time I took ecstasy, but I didn't. My focus at that time was on trying to make the NME better.
Yes.
So there were some NME staffers or NME writers who just became drenched in ecstasy, and but it was hard to miss what was going on in central London at that time. I'd already been to a couple of the clubs in Tooley Street with Martin, who was serious drinking, when they were kind of soul clubs around Tower Bridge. And then when those guys discovered that you could mix, kind of house music with the wooden tops, and that was, people forget that the rise of house music in the UK stemmed from, Weatherall and Oakenfold and those guys mixing music up. It was about breaking down almost the different types of specialist radio show, or the different sections of the NME, and mixing all of that music together. And that's what made that period really exciting, was just that discovery that you could mix it all up. But no, obviously ecstasy became commonplace, but I remember being when the Happy Mondays supported New Order in the GMEX Centre in Manchester.
That was 89. They were doing the Technique album, weren't they?
Yeah, but then not long after, the Mondays headline there. And I can remember being at one of those gigs and just dancing the whole night. And it was like a aerobics class. It was so different to being down the front 5 years before at a Stiff Little Fingers gig or whatever, however long before it was. When you maybe, I don't know, it was 10 years before, just jumping up and down and slamming about. Everyone had their own space and was just working out. That's what it was kind of. But no, I don't remember I remember the first time I took other drugs, but not ecstasy.
Yeah.
I think it just became so common. It wasn't like, it just became such a, that music and ecstasy became just as common as alcohol and music had been before in clubs.
Yes. And the NME during that stage, there's always these kind of periods, because I did an interview with Nick Kent, who started in the early 70s at the NME, or mid. And he said there were still journalists there waiting for the Beatles to reform. And he obviously thought, no, Grandad, they've been and gone. This is punk. And did you also have that same experience when you were at the NME, thinking there's people here still harking on about the good old days in the 5 years ago, whereas things are changing? And
no, that wasn't the case. When I joined the NME, it was in quite a dysfunctional place, in that it was really, really schizophrenic in terms of the quality of the paper each week and the subjects of the paper. The point I make in Animal House was it would be diverse in its cover choices, but then there would be, if they sometimes, to show that they could be diverse, they'd do something like a thrash metal special. They'd have features on Anthrax and Metallica or whoever, Slayer. And then the following week, there'd be nothing at all anywhere in the paper. So from an editing point of view, or from being a fan of that music point of view, it just wasn't working. And Ian Pye gave me my job, but he wasn't a strong editor, in that when I got there, really the guy in charge, I felt, was Stuart Cosgrove, Stuart was a formidable operator. He was brilliant at identifying a trend or, a special edition. But a lot of his interests would have just been better suited for probably the face. They were quite niche. A lot of the things he was into were quite hard to get your hands on, like, particularly, a lot of like Chicago house records or shag music from Carolina. And obviously, if you're on the NME and London Records or Island Records were paying for you to go and meet these people, it was accessible. But if you were like, you know, a young person living in Derby, it wasn't quite so easy to get hold of that kind of lifestyle or that music. And so it was focused on new things and things that were happening. But it just seemed to be a little bit all over the shop,
Yes.
you know, which was a pity, because sometimes it looked great, sometimes it had great covers, and it still had good writers there. But the enemy that really changed my life was, you know, probably the end of Nick Logan's period and into Neil Spencer's period, when there'd be a real defined sense of it being the same paper every week, only with different bands in it. And the things that I absolutely loved about it that inspired it was the sense of, you know, first of all, it's confidence, the sense that you feel like you're in a really good part of a really good community or a really good club. And you'd start to see the kind of like the cross-reference between different bands and different writers, the quality of the writing. I found it totally inspiring when I found the music papers, which I discovered them before I started my fanzine, because it just seemed to be a place where you could do all the things they were telling me not to do at school.
Yes.
You know,
Absolutely. I mean, did you also embrace the kind of the grunge period alongside because there had been the Chicago house scene and acid house scene. Did you also enjoy that kind of world of Seattle rock?
not massively. You know, you're talking about Mudhoney, Tad, all of those guys. I mean, they just looked a bit shit, I thought. I mean, I kind of, you know, maybe it goes back to being kind of 7, watching how bands looked. I think if a band looks good, you kind of, it's another battle. You know, it's another part of the battle that's winning you over. And I just thought they all looked a bit of a fucking mess. But also, I remember, you know, to be fair, it was Sounds, the end of Tony Stewart's Sounds, that were championing those bands.
Yeah.
And I mean, I love the Pixies. I really like the Pixies. I went on the road with them in California and did an NME cover for them. And Adrian Thrills loved the Throwing Muses. So you know, that sort of 4AD end of it, which wasn't really quite so noisy. I like Dinosaur Jr. I saw them and saw Jay Mascis a few times. I thought they were a really good band. But I kind of like, in some respects, I like noise, but I also quite like songs.
Yes. In the book, you mention Ken Kesey, but you also mention Ken Campbell. Is this the Ken Campbell who wrote a 9-hour play called The Warp? Or is this a different Ken Campbell? Can you
Well,
remember
no,
that?
he was a sort of performance artist, wasn't he?
Yes.
Yeah.
Because I
I
didn't.
used to see him and David Rappaport on the CND marches.
Right. And I was kind of.
But I think he was a big influence on Bill Drummond. That's the.
Jimmy.
Yeah, that's the context that he's mentioned in Animal House.
Yeah, because I did an interview with Neil Oram, who also co-wrote The Warp with a Ken Campbell, and I wondered if you were referring to that same Ken Campbell.
It might be. I don't know a great deal about him, apart from, you know, you just see him cropping up on all sorts of different things. I think he was in I was watching Fawlty Towers the other day with my little boy. I think he's in that.
Yeah.
But he would always be on the CND marches. Him and David Rappaport, who was an actor.
Yes, that's right. Because it's kind of interesting your timing when we get into so we have the Thatcher years, the anti-poll tax period, and then John Major years come along. And then the death of Kurt Cobain is when you start Loaded, which is
the very dates we finished it. And I mean, that was a really unusual day. As I said, I'd met Kurt with the legend who became known as Everett True.
Yes.
His real name's Jerry, but when I first met Jerry, he was the legend, and he had a fanzine, and he had records out. I think his first ever record on Creation was The Legend, and then him and Alan had fallen out, but they were both obsessive music fans. Jerry's level of purity and his obsession with music was so intense that he was a good writer. He was quite comical at times, and he'd worked on the NME, and then I think he moved to I don't know when he moved to Melody Maker, but I don't think I had anything to do with it. I think he'd gone by the time I got to the NME. I don't know, but he was good friends with Kurt. I remember him bringing him over. He bought him. He brought him over to me the night they played Reading, but he was bringing him to introduce him to me, not the other way around. Because this is James. He's a feature editor at the NME, and he came over and we had a chat. And obviously they were the standout band because they just hit that sweet spot. And I'll give you an example. I really like that Nirvana Unplugged that MTV did, where you can actually hear the songs. So I think other people were just kind of writing about that stuff. I mean, all of those bands got covered in NME, but I wasn't writing about them.
No, it was just that kind of, you look back and you can see little chapters happening, especially in youth culture and music. And that moment where that was, grunge had finished really, hadn't it, at that point? And there was too many men with the look and the hair and the jacket. And
they just looked like sorry to interrupt, they just looked like Black Sabbath roadies.
Yeah, they did.
And you know what I mean? They kind of like...
And they were whining about their stepdad living in small town.
I guess it wasn't really about how they looked, but, it wasn't.
We didn't like their biceps, did we? But then, so one of the things, because briefly, one of the things that really surprised me in your loaded period, and I'm sure everyone's going to ask you this, is this you did this test on white jeans, okay, and you used all these different washing fabrics.
Yeah.
And you said that Ecova came out the best. Now, I remember going through an Ecova phase, and I thought it was dreadful. So was this actually something that you found, a fact?
Yeah, no, it was true. It was true. I mean, it wasn't there was some structure to the test. We were having a lot of the really good content in Loaded came about because we would just, from things that we were talking about, and I would just think, that would make a great story. And Danny Baker was doing an updated version of the Daz, the doorstep challenge sort of thing. And it was straight. It wasn't ironic or funny. And somebody was like having a go at the ads and moaning about it. And I said, why don't we really just try and see which does wash whiter? So we sort of reenacted the Persil ads. My memory throughout the 70s was all these squeaky clean looking kids in white vests and shorts jumping over stiles and splashing in puddles in woods, and they all looked idyllic and totally different to if I came in with my school uniform covered in mud from playing football, where you just get a bollocking. Wouldn't be a smiling mum, like, smelling the washing powder as it came out of the washing machine or anything like that. And so we set off down to Wimbledon Common with a load of white Levi's that we blagged from Levi's, and a load of white vests we bought from Lawrence Corner, Army and Navy. And we just did what the ad did. We jumped in and out of the ponds on Wimbledon Common, rubbed up against trees, fell and dived into muddy puddles full of leaves, and we just made them absolutely filthy. Then we went back to somebody's house, poured curry over them, beer over them. I think we threw some burnt matches on them, that sort of thing. We just put as many different stains as we could. And then we sent the office junior and the work experience off to a laundrette with a huge pile of change. But we were really insistent, make sure every outfit was in a different plastic bag and it was attached to a different washing powder. And the one that came back whitest was Ecova. But to be honest, they weren't rigorous conditions. They could easily have got it on. Or it might have been that they put so much of it in, because I don't think the washing powder came back. And it might have been they just put so much in. Or I don't think Ecova were using it to tell the world that they were going to make things white.
I was just kind of surprised. And also, there was also in the book, you mentioned you were at a dinner party with, I think, your wife and a woman called Sarah, and you said she said something and then I broke down. But you don't say what she said. Can you remember what she said, or is that not something that you wanted to say?
This was a lot later. This was 6 months after I'd been through rehab and stopped drinking and taking drugs. She was just pretty much, I think she was my second girlfriend when I was about 12 or 13, and she was just talking about some stuff from when we were kids, and it tripped some stuff in me, it kind of like
Right.
I guess of stuff that was just, maybe it made me think about when my mum was ill or something like that. But I think what happened was, when I spoke to the people that helped me get clean, like the doctors and stuff, and the counsellors, they said that when you stopped taking cocaine, what had happened was that my brain wasn't creating serotonin because it was so used to it being artificially created by the stimulants. So it was just, I'd never really been depressed, and that's what it was. I was just like, they gave me some sertraline to jumpstart my nerve endings, and
Yes. My God, that was quite a moment, wasn't it?
but it wasn't. No, it wasn't. That wasn't something that I deliberately chose not to put in. It was just, she was just talking about a period when, I think she was just talking about a period when my parents were splitting up. My mum was in and out of hospital, and I think it just tipped me over the edge a bit.
Yes. And just, I sort of vaguely said it at the beginning, but when you talk about your loaded period compared to the 80s period, there seems a lot more reflection, as if, I don't know if I got this right, but you were, because there was a lot of tragedy, isn't there, in the loaded period? There was people dying, people struggling, in retrospect, I suppose at the time you were all having a good time. Did writing that bit feel quite different to writing the early years? Because the book feels like it's like a definite half time and then there's a different second half, isn't there? And I just wondered, when you were sitting there writing this, you felt...
No, I had a brilliant time at Loaded. It was just absolutely fantastic. I think it's 20 years since I started it. I think maybe it's even, no, it's not. It's 30 years. It's 30, it's
I know,
30
we have to use
years.
our fingers now going back.
It's 30 years. So I'm obviously being 57 now. I've been writing a book over the last 6 years. I've been a parent since I was 36. So I've been a parent for like 21 years. I've spent a lot of time being sober and clean myself, and also spending a lot of time with other recovering addicts, and then talking to people who have actually got active drug and drink problems. You just become more aware of the consequences of your behavior. So the book was written from the perspective of somebody that's seen both sides of the coin, really. The fun. Well, and there's basically three sides. There's the fun, and then there's the bit when it stops being fun, and then there's the bit, if you're lucky, when you get out of it and get beyond it. So it was just written from a different point of view, rather than, if I'd written the book when I was, 31 or 32 or something, it wouldn't have had that reflection. And also, I think when you become a parent, you just become more conscious that you're not the center of the world. And so it's just that I'm just slightly more. Sometimes I read things about me. I see things on, like, I just think these people have got no idea what I'm really like, nor have I been for many, many years. So, I think even the stuff about, people are talking in social media, in articles about, or in interviews about, the recovery period that I wrote about and how I seem different then. But even that is like, I've been clean and sober for 24 years. So it's just a different person. And I think, I could have just written a whole book about excessive and funny behavior at Loaded, but I didn't want to do that. I wanted to do more than that. And the publishers wanted me to do more than that. Nobody knew about the kind of some of the personal things that were going on in my life. And nobody in the public domain had really known too much about, my dealing with my addiction and getting through that, and who helped me with that. So I just felt, I guess I feel to a degree, as I say in Animal House, that the reason I'm quite open about writing about that stuff in there is because we were just flying the flag and banging the drums so much for getting fucked up and Loaded.
Yes.
It would be irresponsible of me not to at least offer a different perspective on the consequences of that.
Yeah. God.
I love drinking, David. I loved drinking. I loved how it made me feel. And in the music business and the business of journalism, heavy drinking during the day were not seen as a negative thing. And then certainly, if you look at iconic artists who have lived or who have died, you know, their images have been buffed up with their excessive drug and drink use. And I was kind of enthralled to all of that. People like John Belushi, whose film Animal House, I named the book after, Iggy, I guess Keith and Ronnie in the Stones, you know, just that kind of, it's just part of the rock and roll armor, isn't it? You know, kind of drugs and drink and going way back before white guys were playing guitars. You know, if you go back to the blues musicians, you know, the problems they were having with or their reliance on smack or whatever, and the jazz musicians as well. So it's part and parcel of certain aspects of the history of music and film. And yeah, that was kind of, I was attracted to that.
Yes, well, absolutely. Because when we were growing up and you'd hear musicians talking about why they got into music, they often used to say it's sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And obviously, you realised about 20 years ago, someone said, don't say that anymore because you should be in prison now. So perhaps forget the sex, drugs, and rock and roll. And yeah, because we grew up listening.
I mean, being in a band, if you I mean, there's lots of different motivators for being a band, but actually being in a successful band, if you're a young man or woman, is actually a fantastic thing, you know. And it isn't just men. I mean, pretty much quite early on in this, I'm going to have to be careful who I mention here, but quite early on in my days at the NME, a very, very well-known female singer rang the office to talk to one of the writers because the writer had walked in on her fucking the support act before the gig, and she was married, and it you know, there was it wasn't just, you know, it's not just guys that behave like that, you know, when they're out on the road. And obviously music was more male dominated in those days, but it was I think there are a few better things that you could possibly do than be a, you know, young musician, or even I guess an old musician if it's still exciting, and being off, going around the world. I think that's that thing I put when I first went, the first time I went abroad as a paid music journalist rather than as a fanzine writer going with bands I knew, was when I went to Holland with Popple Eat Itself. And I mean, neither the band nor I could really believe that we were doing the same thing that we'd both been doing when we met in Huddersfield at the Peace Hall, but we were getting paid to do it. Yeah. You know, I was writing an article about Popple Eat Itself for the cover of Sounds, and they were getting to play in different cities in Holland and getting paid enough to make it worth their while. And it was just like a school trip. I mean, we were in our teens. It was only 2 years since I'd been on a school trip, you know, so it was like, I think that's the other thing, is that the point I make about Weller's writing, about, you know, how amazing his run of writing of singles in the Jam were when he was in his late teens, that, you know, when I was an NME writer, I left because I thought I was too old. That's why I left the NME. I was 25. I thought I'd had my go, and I felt like it was time for somebody else, you know, Sarah Champion or somebody to come in and be the, you know, the mouthy young writer and kind of explode all over the papers. And so that was a key. I mean, I didn't think I'd be 57, David. I thought I would probably finish at 33 and a third. You know, I didn't think I'd get to like be 45, or genuinely, I don't mean that in a dramatic way. I had no concept. I can remember the financial advisor coming in to NME, and this kind of quite serious, straight-looking person talking to some of the staff, and then watch them having a long conversation with Steve Lamack, who sat opposite me when we were in the second office we had. And after they went, I said, Steve, what's that? What are you doing? He said, oh, that's that letter we got last week. It's a financial advisor. If you put away 300 quid a month from your wages, when you're kind of like 40, you'll have whatever it would be, whatever Steve's got now. And I just remember thinking, this is fucking nuts. Why would you do that? I want my money because I want to go, I want to go and buy, I don't even know, I guess I want to buy a drink. I don't really know. I can't remember what I was spending my money on at the NME, because I got all the music for free and I got a lot of travel for free, but I just had no concept. And that sort of intensity of that short-sightedness and that living in the moment was just so much of what was driving me, really. I kind of it was more about getting away from where I'd been rather than planning for what was going to happen when I was middle-aged.
Yeah.
I had no comprehension of what my life, and now actually my life is really nice. I'm happy and I've got a good life, and it might be good for me that I'm not actually doing all that stuff anymore. That's never occurred to me before, that actually
it's
going at a slower pace might have been good for me.
Because Alan McGee in the last 3 years in lockdown went on these walks, where he still does, doesn't he? And he lost an enormous amount of weight, and now is looking trim and slim and much more
15 miles a day, he told me.
15 miles a day. It's amazing. I know, 30,000 steps. So, yes, it does happen. But if you could have told your 16-year-old self some words of wisdom when they were starting out, is there anything that you would have just said, oh, I would do this, or don't do this, wait to your 16-year-old
Well,
self?
you know what the big issue just asked me if I'd write that piece they have, which is that I think I'd get more good advice now from the 16-year-old. I think the 16-year-old, 17-year-old me had a better take on what was happening. I do think that. I think I do. I think they had a clearer vision of what life could be and where, and what, I'd love to have that drive again. I'd love to have that focus of, I just wanted to work on the NME. I couldn't comprehend doing anything else. And I wanted to be a footballer. And then I was quite a good footballer when I was a kid, but I was very skinny. And I used to play for teams that were older than me at school.
Did you want to be Alan Clark?
Yeah, I did. I wanted to be a footballer. And then the first year we had trials. They didn't send me for trials. So I knew straight away. So I wasn't, having that dream and having it taken away from me. And then I also, I didn't really want to be a rock star or anything. I don't know why I didn't want that. I just kind of thought it would be better being a writer, I don't know why that. I did have a band. We were pretty popular in Leeds, but I didn't. Weirdly, this is an ex-pop star who I've never spoken to.
Nice.
Who I must have spoken to because I've got a number, but ringing me. That's strange. I was turning that off. So the drive and the ambition that I had. You mentioned earlier that there weren't many opportunities. When I left school, I genuinely only knew 2 guys with jobs who had left school the same year as me. One worked in his dad's greengrocers and one had left the year before. In those days, if you got an apprenticeship, you could leave age 15. And this other guy I was in the class with had gone and become an apprentice butcher. And I knew another guy called Varka, who was a year older than me. And he wanted to be a doctor. And in between finishing his A-levels and getting his results, he got a job on a temp agency. We used to go to his house after school and he would tell us about what he'd been doing. It was just weird, just saying. I remember him being working in a dynamite company, or, what they called a quarry. Right, some sort of open mining or quarrying and talking about just sitting there. I thought he'd be blowing things up, but he was just sitting in an office putting files, putting paper in files. So it sounds strange to say that now. So the lack of opportunities of employment when I was leaving school meant I could just see this little bit of light at the end of a tunnel. And that was the possibility of getting on this paper that would allow me to do what I did, what I was enthusiastic about, which was music and also to a degree politics.
Yes, blimey O'Reilly. Well, look, James, this has been amazing. And thank you again. I've really loved the book. It's been just amazing, So
Barbara Ellen told me, Barbara Ellen, she worked with, she wrote for my magazine, Loaded and she also was, I brought her onto the NME. she said that you were enthused about it. Have you had her on?
No.
She would be a good interview. I mean, Barbara used to live with Jarvis,
Right.
which people probably don't know. And she was a writer like me from when she was very, very young. I first met her on Zigzag, and then I opened an envelope from her. She was in the same pile as Stuart McConey.
Yes, and I remember this bit where she's quite rock and roll in the book as well, isn't she?
She's quite rock and roll.
Yes.
Believe me, there's a lot of things I took out about Barbara and I in the book. But she would be a really good interview, I think, because she was such a brilliant writer. I remember her writing something about Norman Tebbit. I only threatened to resign from the enemy twice. One was when they took something out that she'd written about Norman Tebbit or his family in a Ghost Dance review. It was so brutal. She was such an acerbic writer. I mean, very much following in that line of Antonella Back and Stephen Wells and Judy Burchell and Tony Parsons and Paul Morley, those people who just were totally unafraid just to get the knife out. And then so.
Well, I love the line about you did was it fragrance? And she said the winning one was smelled like a rapist.
Yeah, it's sort of, I mean, Barbara's a great writer.
Yeah.
Look, thank you very much.
Yeah,
I've enjoyed it. And also, can I just say, if anyone's listening to this who wants a copy of Animal House, Waterstones have messed up their distribution service. So new books are struggling to get in there. So if somebody wants a book that's signed and dedicated, I can do that if they just go to my social media at James Brown, Twitter and Instagram. Excellent. Or, of course, the bookseller.org of all the independent bookshops. And if you want it fast and cheap, Amazon as well. So that's where you get it from.
There you go. Well, look, thank you ever so much. It's been
Thanks, David.
Brilliant. Take care. Thanks, James.
Bye-bye. I really enjoyed the interview.
Cheers. Bye-bye. And there you go. That's it, dear listener. The end. And obviously a bit disappointed with my vocal being that quiet. But never mind. That's life. Anyway, a massive thank you to James Brown for giving me the time for that. That's been his life and his book, Animal House, which is available, as he said, from all good bookshops and also, well, not Waterstones probably, but online. Do check it out. And also you can, if you want to contact me for some reason, you can on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter. You can just do C86 Show. Also, all these have been archived, so you can find those on Spotify, iTunes, Podbean. That's true. Anyway, have a great week. Stay safe.